At Henri Chapelle, Plot C, Row 11, Grave 55, has no photograph. No family stands there, only a name, a rank, and a service number carved into white stone. Staff Sergeant Thomas J. Forte. A modern investigator stops each year, running a finger along the edge of the marker. "We're still looking for his picture," she says. "I can't pretend I know what it feels like to vanish this way. I Sastin, but I can see the shape of it." Forte's death was recorded cleanly. His life, who knew him, who waited, was archived away. The grave is precise, the memory is not. Thomas J. Forte learned early how to measure a day by what it demanded from him. In Hinds County, Mississippi, mornings began before the sun climbed over the flat fields. The air smelled of damp soil and iron-rich dust, and the sound that carried farthest was not birdsong but the scrape of tools against wood and metal. As a boy, he followed routines shaped less by clocks than by seasons: cotton time, planting time, harvest time. When the fields needed hands, school paused. When money thinned, children worked. His father, Jackson Forte, rose first. Thomas remembered the way Jackson washed his hands in a tin basin, rubbing until the skin went pale, as if cleanliness itself were a form of dignity. Florence Catchings, his mother, folded laundry with care, even when the cloth was patched thin. Juanita, his sister, learned to read faces early, when to speak, when to wait. This was not a quiet household, but it was a careful one. Words were chosen. Movements mattered. Thomas finished grammar school, something that did not happen easily or often. He walked there when weather allowed, shoes scuffed at the toes, a notebook wrapped in brown paper to keep it dry. He practiced sums by candlelight and read aloud when his mother asked him to, steadying his voice on each sentence. Education was not framed as escape. It was framed as preparation, knowing enough to not be caught unaware. There was a habit he kept even then. Before leaving the house, he checked his pockets. Pencil, paper, whatever small item the day required. It was a way of feeling ready, even when he was not. "I'll be back before dark," he told his mother more than once, though the promise bent easily under labor's demands. Mississippi in those years pressed down hard. Laws did not need to announce themselves. They were felt in where you could stand, sit, or wait. Thomas learned routes through town that avoided trouble. He learned when to lower his eyes and when to keep walking. None of this was spoken about directly. It didn't have to be. Everyone understood the terms. By his early 20s, Thomas wanted space room to breathe that did not feel rationed. Louisiana offered work and movement, even if it carried its own limits. He left with little ceremony. A small bag, a jacket that had belonged to his father, addresses written carefully on a folded slip of paper. Florence hugged him once, tight and brief, then stepped back. "Write when you can," she said. "I will," Thomas answered. And he did. In Louisiana, days took on a different rhythm. There were factories, warehouses, kitchens that needed men who showed up on time and did what they were told. Thomas worked where he could. He learned quickly, watched how supervisors counted hours, noted which men were trusted with keys. He saved when saving was possible. He sent money home when it wasn't. It was there he met the woman who would become his wife. Her name appears nowhere in the official records that survive him, but her presence shaped the rest of his life. They met through ordinary means, introduced by someone who knew someone else, crossing paths where workdays overlapped. She laughed easily. He did not, at first, but he listened. They walked when evenings cooled, the smell of cooking drifting from open windows. They spoke about practical things: rent, work, how long the week felt. He told her about Mississippi, about finishing school, about Juanita's sharp memory. She told him what she wanted: someday, a small place, steady food, children who did not have to leave school early. There was urgency in their courtship, not romance. The world felt unstable. News traveled fast. Decisions followed. On January 19th, 1942, they married. The ceremony was brief. No elaborate clothes, no long meal afterward. Thomas bought a ring made of tin, because it was what he could afford. He turned it in his fingers before handing it to her, apologetic without saying so. "It's temporary," he said, meaning the ring, the lack, the moment. She slid it on anyway. "It's enough," she replied. That ring mattered. It was light. It dulled quickly, but it stayed. After the wedding, Thomas's routine sharpened. He rose early, wrote letters late, checked his pockets before leaving. Pencil, paper. The ring, now worn by someone else, but always present in his thoughts. He carried letters after enlistment, folded carefully, edges worn soft from rereading. They were not long. They did not need to be. "I'll do my part and come home," he wrote once. A sentence that held both hope and instruction. I can't pretend I know what it felt like to make promises while knowing how little control you had over whether you could keep them. But I can see the weight of that tin ring, how it stood in for a future he could imagine but not secure. Thomas enlisted with the sense that the commitment was bounded. Service had an end. War, in his mind, was a chapter, not the whole book. He believed competence would protect him, that following rules mattered. He told his wife he would write often. He told his parents not to worry. He told Juanita to keep studying. These were not dramatic farewells. They were instructions for how to continue while he was gone. Training introduced him to new repetitions. Marching, cleaning, counting. He adapted. The structure made sense. He watched men around him, noticed who struggled and who steadied others. Promotion came not because of speeches, but because he remembered names, kept supplies in order, corrected mistakes quietly. Staff sergeant was not a title he bragged about. It was a responsibility he accepted. Letters went back and forth. He asked about small things, weather, food, whether the ring still fit. He shared little about where he was going or what he would face. That was not secrecy. It was protection. Before departure, he folded his wife's last letter and placed it with the others. He touched the pocket where it rested. A habit by then. "Keep it safe," she had said, referring to herself, to the future, to him. Thomas believed the war would be temporary. He believed routines could be rebuilt. He believed objects mattered because they carried memory forward. The last night before shipping out, he lay awake listening to the sounds of other men breathing, shifting, murmuring in sleep. He checked his pockets once more. Pencil, paper, letters. Outside, the air was cold. Inside, the world he knew narrowed to what he could carry. That was Thomas J. Forte, before Wereth, a man defined not by how he would die, but by how carefully he lived. The 333 Field Artillery Battalion did not come into being because the Army wanted to celebrate black excellence. It came into being because the Army needed bodies it could organize, assign, and move without protest. On paper, the battalion solved a logistical problem. In practice, it became a place where capability and neglect lived side by side. When Thomas J. Forte was assigned to the unit, he entered a system that depended on him while quietly preparing to forget him. Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, stretched across red clay that clung to boots and uniforms like a second skin. Rain turned the ground into sucking mud. Heat baked it into dust that coated throats and eyes. Forte learned the camp through repetition. Reveille cut the dark before sunrise. Men formed lines while breath fogged the air. Inspections followed. Boots checked, rifles examined, posture corrected. Every day carried the same rhythm, designed to wear individuality down to efficiency. Segregation shaped everything. Black enlisted men lived together in crowded barracks. White officers occupied separate quarters, ate at different tables, entered buildings through different doors. None of this was written into training manuals. It was enforced through habit and tone. Forte noticed which officers spoke to him directly and which spoke around him. He noticed how praise was delivered quietly, as if acknowledgement itself were dangerous. "You're responsible for keeping them sharp," a lieutenant told him once. Eyes on a clipboard rather than on Forte's face. "Yes, sir," Forte answered, his voice even. Promotion arrived without ceremony. Forte did not celebrate becoming a staff sergeant. He absorbed it. The rank meant more men to watch, more mistakes to prevent, more responsibility carried without complaint. He learned which soldiers froze under pressure, which masked fear with humor, which needed firm correction, and which needed a steady word. He never corrected in anger. He understood that humiliation weakened cohesion. The M1 100-55 mm howitzer, the long tom, demanded precision. Each shell weighed nearly 100 pounds. Each firing sequence involved commands spoken clearly and obeyed instantly. Forte memorized procedures until his body responded, before his mind finished the thought. He felt the concussion through his chest, When the gun fired, the metallic taste that followed heavy barrages. He learned to read the gun crew the way farmers read weather, by posture, by breathing, by the set of shoulders. The army trusted Forte and his men with weapons capable of demolishing concrete fortifications. It did not trust them with authority beyond their narrow function. They were expected to perform flawlessly and remain invisible. Competence did not lead to opportunity. It led to assignment. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to be relied upon and dismissed at the same time. But I can see how it teaches restraint, how it trains a person to anchor themselves in routine when recognition is withheld. When deployment orders came, Forte packed with care. He folded letters from home, his wife's handwriting precise, his mother's steady, and placed them in an inner pocket of his jacket. He checked that pocket before every formation, a small ritual that reminded him he was tethered to something beyond the army's expectations. Normandy offered no welcome. The battalion arrived after the beaches had been secured, stepping onto land scarred by shell craters and broken hedgerows. Forte supervised gun placement, adjusting for terrain, calculating distances, ensuring his men understood their roles. Days blurred together fire missions, repositioning, maintenance, exhaustion. He watched for shaking hands, for lapses in attention that could turn deadly. At Brest, the battalion proved its value under sustained pressure. German defenses were thick, layered with concrete and steel. The long toms fired again and again, recoil hammering bones. Forte rotated crews to prevent collapse, enforced rest even when men protested. After long barrages, he walked the line, checking faces, offering brief words. "You did what you were supposed to," he told one exhausted gunner, gripping his shoulder once before moving on. Reports later recorded the unit's effectiveness. Those reports were filed, not celebrated. Success was absorbed quietly, as if acknowledgement would disrupt the order of things. As autumn slid toward winter, the battalion moved east through France and into Belgium. The pace slowed. Orders grew less precise. They were reassigned to a sector near the Ardennes forest, wooded, cold, and deceptive. Soldiers called it the Ghost Front, a place believed to be quiet, low risk. Forte did not share that confidence. Quiet felt provisional. Snow arrived early and stayed. It crept into boots, stiffened fingers, froze mechanisms. Forte adjusted routines, extra time to warm hands. Shells covered carefully. Movement slowed to prevent accidents. He wrote letters describing the cold, the trees bent under snow, the waiting that filled hours more than action did. Leadership treated the sector as expendable space. New infantry units rotated in with minimal preparation. Forte noticed how thin the lines were, how withdrawal routes were assumed rather than secured. He said little to officers. He said more to his men. "Stay ready," he told them one night as they huddled around weak heat. Quiet doesn't mean safe. No one explained to Forte how the army ranked its units in terms of loss. No one needed to. Placement told the story. Segregated units were positioned where failure would not shock the public. Forte did not frame it as policy. He framed it as obligation to keep his men alive as long as possible. December tightened the cold until it felt personal. Coffee cooled before it could be finished. Weapons froze. Sleep came in short bursts. Forte developed small habits, tapping frozen parts before handling them, counting heads repeatedly, checking his pocket when stress rose. The letters inside mattered. They reminded him that time existed beyond the present moment. On the night before the German offensive, the forest felt wrong. Too still. Forte walked the positions, boots crunching softly. He paused, listening, breath held. Somewhere far off, artillery echoed, faint but persistent. I can't say he knew what was coming, but I can say he understood when the quiet no longer made sense. The attack came before dawn. German forces broke through with speed and force that overwhelmed assumptions. Orders overlapped, communications fractured. Forte's battery fired until movement was impossible. Vehicles jammed. Guns were abandoned only when survival demanded it. Command structures dissolved. Forte gathered men where he could, counting, deciding without guidance. Escape, capture, or death narrowed quickly. Rank mattered less than clarity. "Stay together," he told them. "Follow me." They moved on foot through deep snow, weapons light, bodies heavy. Forte set the pace, steady and deliberate. He felt the letters press against his chest with each step, a physical reminder of promises made under different circumstances. This was where institutional neglect became immediate. Not in ideology, but in logistics, in plans that assumed some units would not return. Forte did not articulate that thought. He did not have the luxury. He had men watching him, trusting him. By then, the war had already decided how little space his story would occupy in official memory. But Thomas J. Forte did not know that. He knew only that responsibility followed him, even when the system fell away. And so he kept moving, carrying his men, his habits, and the quiet discipline of someone who had learned that being necessary did not guarantee being remembered. The German offensive began before daylight on December 16, 1944, with an intensity that erased assumptions in minutes. Artillery rolled across the Ardennes like a physical force, shaking ground that had been quiet for weeks. The sector around Schoenberg, thinly held and poorly prepared, buckled almost immediately. For the men of the 333 Field Artillery Battalion, the change was abrupt, one moment waiting, the next reacting. Thomas J. Forte was with Battery C when the first reports came through. Lines of communication failed quickly. Orders arrived late or not at all. The snow muffled sound in ways that confused distance and direction. Forte did what he had always done. He counted his men, assessed what could still move, and made decisions without waiting for clarity that would not come. German armor cut through planned withdrawal routes. Vehicles stalled. Some artillery pieces were pulled free under fire. Others were abandoned where they stood. Forte understood the meaning of that decision. A gun left behind was more than equipment. It was proof the plan had collapsed. By mid-morning, fragments of units moved independently through the forest. Forte gathered men as he encountered them. Familiar faces mixed with strangers. Rank became secondary. Survival depended on staying together and moving deliberately. North, someone said, uncertain. Keep moving, Forte replied. We adjust as we go. 11 men ultimately formed around him, not by design, but by circumstance. They represented different states, different accents, different habits. What they shared was exhaustion, hunger, and the understanding that capture by German forces carried risks beyond imprisonment. They moved on foot, weapons light, boots soaked through by snow that melted and refroze with every step. The forest pressed close. Branches bent under ice. Breath came hard, each exhale visible. They rationed words the way they rationed energy. Forte set the pace, stopping when someone lagged, urging without shouting. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to move through enemy territory, knowing that every sound might give you away. But I can see the discipline required to keep fear from splintering a group already frayed. They avoided roads, followed tree lines, crossed fields only when necessary. Hunger sharpened tempers. One man joked weakly about coffee. No one laughed. Forte checked his pocket once, feeling the edges of folded letters, then returned his attention to the men around him. By the afternoon of December 17th, they reached the outskirts of Wereth, a village so small it barely registered on maps. 9 houses, narrow lanes, smoke rising thinly from chimneys. It looked ordinary, almost gentle. They approached the farm of Matthias Langer cautiously. Langer was a local farmer, a man whose life had already been shaped by shifting borders and occupations. He spoke German, lived under imposed authority, and understood danger instinctively. When he opened his door and saw the men cold, armed, clearly lost, he hesitated only briefly. Come inside, he said, his voice low. The warmth hit them immediately. Not comfort, but contrast. Bread appeared. Coffee, weak but hot. Jam spread thinly. Forte watched his men eat slowly, deliberately, as if afraid the moment would vanish if rushed. Steam rose from cups. Hands trembled less. Langer's family moved quietly, aware of the risk. Sheltering Allied soldiers was punishable by death. Forte understood that too. He spoke to Langer in careful terms, explaining who they were, what they needed, direction, time, perhaps a chance to move on. We won't stay long, Forte said. That promise mattered. It acknowledged the cost to the people offering help. Outside, the village watched. Wereth was not isolated from loyalties. Some residents sympathized with the German cause. Others feared it. Someone noticed the black American soldiers. Someone made a decision. The warning arrived, not as sound, but as presence. Vehicles, boots. Voices speaking with authority that brooked no negotiation. A unit of Waffen-SS moved into the village, alerted to the men's location. Forte saw the shift immediately. The way Langer's posture changed, the way silence fell inside the room, not absence of sound, but the tightening before consequence. If they ran, the Langer family would pay. Forte did not need to be told that. German reprisals were known, even if not spoken aloud. He gathered his men quickly. "We surrender," one of them said. The word heavy. No one argued. The decision was not framed as trust in mercy, but as protection of civilians who had already risked everything. Forte stepped forward when the SS entered. Hands visible. "We're soldiers," he said. "We'll go with you. I can't pretend I know what it costs to choose captivity, to spare strangers. But I can see the weight of that choice and how deliberately it was made." The 11 men were marched out of the village, away from houses and witnesses, toward open ground. Snow crunched under boots. The sky was low and gray. Forte walked among his men, close enough to steady them with presence alone. Rank no longer offered protection. Uniforms no longer guaranteed treatment under rules of war. Racial hatred layered itself onto military brutality, escalating what might have been imprisonment into something else entirely. They were not taken to a camp. They were taken to a field. What happened there was not witnessed by those who could intervene. It was reconstructed later, through evidence, through bodies, through patterns of injury. At the time, it unfolded without record, without interruption. 2 months later, the snow began to recede. The Ardennes thawed unevenly, revealing ground that had been hidden. A local boy noticed shapes in a field that did not belong to the landscape. Hermann Langer, Matthias's son, remembered where the soldiers had been taken. He led American forces back to the site. What they found confirmed fears. 11 bodies, uniforms torn, injuries that spoke of cruelty, extended beyond necessity. Forte was identified, among them Staff Sergeant. Service number intact, rank no longer relevant. U.S. Army investigators documented everything. Photographs were taken. Autopsies conducted. Reports written in careful language that cataloged broken bones, bayonet wounds, gunshots. The conclusion was clear. A war crime. Then the file was sealed. Why this crime did not enter public reckoning the way others did remains a matter of record and omission. The Malmedy massacre, committed by the same SS division, became a symbol. Wereth did not. The men were buried quietly. Their families were notified with standardized language, killed in action. Forte's wife received no explanation. His parents were not told where he had fallen. The tin ring, the letters, whatever objects remained became disconnected artifacts, stripped of context. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to grieve without a story, to hold loss without explanation. But I can see how that kind of withholding erodes memory over time. Decades passed before the truth resurfaced beyond local knowledge. It survived because the Langer family remembered, because they marked the place privately, because some events refuse to disappear entirely, even when institutions look away. This was the rupture between local memory and official record, between what was known and what was permitted to be known. Thomas J. Forte did not re-enter history through family testimony or government initiative. He returned because strangers refused to let the ground forget him. The discovery did not restore what was taken. It did not reach across decades to explain everything to those who waited. But it reopened the question of whose deaths were allowed to matter, and why some names had to wait so long to be spoken aloud. For Forte, the war ended in a field outside Wereth. The story did not. It simply went underground, carried forward by people who had no obligation to remember him and chose to anyway. The field outside Wereth did not announce what had happened there. When the snow finally began to thin in February 1945, it did so unevenly, revealing patches of earth, frozen grass, and shapes that did not belong to the landscape, a boot first. Then fabric. Then the unmistakable outline of a body that had not fallen in battle, but had been left. U.S. Army units moving back through the area were guided by memory rather than maps. Hermann Langer walked ahead of them, his steps careful, his face fixed on the ground. He did not speak much. He did not need to. "It was here," he said finally, stopping short. "In this field, Investigators moved in methodically. This was not a recovery driven by urgency, but by procedure. The bodies had been exposed to weeks of snow, thaw, and refreeze. Uniforms were torn. Personal items were scattered or missing, yet identification was possible. Dog tags, rank insignia, service numbers. Thomas J. Forte was confirmed among them. Staff Sergeant, Battery C, 333, Field Artillery Battalion. The first task was documentation. Photographs were taken from multiple angles. Measurements recorded. Positions noted. The language used was careful, technical, restrained. Each man was assigned a number before he was described as a person. Autopsies followed. Medical officers worked through the evidence with clinical precision. Broken legs, fractures consistent with blunt force, not shrapnel, crushed skulls, bayonet wounds placed deliberately in areas that would not cause immediate death, fingers severed, eyes damaged. The injuries told a story the paperwork could not soften. This was not combat. This was not the chaos of crossfire. This was controlled violence, extended beyond any military purpose. Thomas Forte's body showed the same pattern. His rank had not shielded him. His uniform had not protected him. The rules he had trusted about surrender, about prisoners, had not applied. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to read a report that reduces a human life to injuries and measurements. But I can see the effort it takes to write such reports without letting horror leak into the margins. The perpetrators were identified by unit, not by name. The Waffen-SS Leibstandart Division, the same formation responsible for the Malmedy massacre just hours earlier. That crime, involving white American soldiers, would become widely known, prosecuted, and memorialized. Wereth followed a different path. The investigative file was thorough, too thorough to ignore. Yet soon after its completion, it was classified, marked secret, filed away. The decision did not come with explanation. No press release, no public accounting. The reasons existed in the space between policy and prejudice. Prosecuting another massacre would complicate post-war objectives. Acknowledging the racial dimension would raise questions the Army was not prepared to answer. The men were reburied with care. Military honors were observed. Crosses marked graves at Henri Chapelle. The system functioned efficiently at this stage. Death was processed. Paperwork completed. What did not happen mattered just as much. No families were called in to hear the truth. No narrative accompanied the medals awarded. The Purple Heart given to Forte spoke only of injury, not of how or why. His wife received a telegram. Killed in action. 4 words that contained no field, no snow, no decision made to protect civilians. His parents were spared details they did not ask for. Details they might have needed. I can't pretend I know which is harder, to be told everything or to be told almost nothing. But I can see how partial truth leaves grief unfinished. For decades, the case remained buried in archives. It existed as a file number, accessed rarely, referenced obliquely. In Wereth, memory persisted differently. The Langer family did not forget the men who had eaten at their table, who had spoken softly, who had chosen surrender to spare them. Herman Langer carried that knowledge into adulthood. He returned to the field often, standing where the snow had once hidden bodies. He spoke of it sparingly, but he spoke of it. They trusted us, he said once, years later. We couldn't let that disappear. End quote. In 1994, he placed a simple wooden cross at the site. No ceremony, no officials. Just names, carved by hand. It was an act of defiance against forgetting. The forensic record did not change with that gesture. The injuries remained the same. The report stayed sealed. But something shifted. Memory moved from private burden to public marker. When the files were eventually reopened, they confirmed what the ground had already said. This was a war crime. This was racial violence layered onto military brutality. This was not an accident of battle. Yet, even then, resolution did not follow. No trials. No named perpetrators held to account. Justice arrived only in fragments, acknowledgement without consequence, recognition without restitution. Thomas Forte remained in Henri Chapelle, Plot C, Row 11, Grave 55. His grave received flowers from people who shared neither blood nor language with him. Volunteers learned his name before they learned his story. I can't pretend that forensic clarity brings emotional closure, but I can see its power to strip away excuses. The evidence leaves no space for reinterpretation. What happened at Wereth was deliberate. What followed the classification, the delay, the quiet, was also deliberate. In that sense, the forensic reconstruction does more than document death. It exposes the second act of violence, the decision to let some losses fade. For Thomas J. Forte, the record exists now in two forms. One, a series of reports describing how his body was broken. The other, a slowly rebuilt memory describing how his humanity endured. Neither is complete. But together, they refuse the comfort of denial. The field outside Wereth no longer hides what it once did. The snow still falls there. The ground still freezes. But the shapes beneath it have names again. Thomas J. Forte was buried far from home, in soil his family had never seen. Henri Chapelle lay quiet and orderly, rows aligned with precision, each grave marked by the same white stone. When his body was placed there, no one from Mississippi stood nearby. No one from Louisiana. No wife holding a folded coat against the cold. No parents asking questions they were not encouraged to ask. The notification that reached home was brief and official. Killed in action. No location beyond a country. No explanation of circumstances. The language was designed to close a chapter, not open one. For Forte's wife, still newly married, the message arrived without context, no indication of whether he suffered, whether he knew what was happening, whether he had been alone. She kept the tin ring. No record tells us where she was when the telegram came, but its impact can be traced through what followed. Silence filled the space where letters had arrived regularly. Habits built around waiting collapsed overnight. There was no body to mourn, no story to repeat, no detail to anchor grief, just absence framed as conclusion. I thought he'd write again. A family member would later say of another Wereth widow. The sentence could have belonged to her as well. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to grieve without narrative, to mourn someone whose final hours are sealed away by policy, but I can see how grief stalls when it has nowhere to go. Forte's parents received the same limited information. Jackson and Florence had raised a son who finished school against the odds, who sent money home, who wrote letters carefully folded. They were told he died serving his country. They were not told how. They were not told where his body lay. The distinction mattered. In homes like theirs, remembrance was practical. Objects carried memory forward. A chair left empty at the table. A coat never reclaimed. A habit of listening for footsteps that would not return. Without a story, those objects lost their direction. Juanita, his sister, would have carried the knowledge differently. She had grown up learning when to speak and when to stay quiet. The war offered no language for her questions. She could not ask officials for details they did not volunteer. She could only remember who her brother had been before the uniform replaced his everyday clothes. Did Forte's wife remarry? Records do not say. If she did, it would not have erased the ring tucked away in a drawer, its surface dulled from wear. If she did not, the absence would have shaped decades of her life, decisions made in the shadow of a future interrupted. The tin ring mattered because it survived disconnected from explanation. It symbolized a promise that ended without ceremony. Along with letters recovered from his body, if they were returned at all, it became an artifact stripped of context. Words written with expectation, read without resolution. Military honors followed protocol. Forte received the Purple Heart, awarded for wounds sustained. The citation offered no detail. It did not describe the field outside Wereth, the decision to surrender, the brutality that followed. It did not need to. The system was not designed to carry nuance. I can't pretend that medals compensate for withheld truth, but I can see how they function as placeholder symbols meant to stand in for stories that never arrive. For years, Forte's name existed primarily in lists. Service number, unit, grave location. His life before the war faded from public view. His death remained unexamined. Family memory, without reinforcement, thinned. In Mississippi and Louisiana, the war moved on. Other losses claimed attention. Stories passed down selectively, shaped by what could be confirmed. Forte's became a fragment. He died in the war, repeated without elaboration, eventually spoken less often. Meanwhile, in Belgium, memory took a different form. The Langer family did not forget the men who had arrived cold and hungry at their door. They remembered faces, voices, the way the soldiers had thanked them for bread and coffee. They remembered the choice those men made to surrender rather than flee and risk civilian lives. That memory did not reach Forte's family. It existed parallel to their grief, unshared. Decades passed before the truth surfaced beyond local knowledge. When it did, it arrived too late to meet those who needed it most. Forte's parents were gone. His wife, if living, had built a life around an incomplete understanding. Juanita aged without answers. Honor came eventually, but it arrived without recipients. At Henri Chapelle, volunteers began tending Forte's grave. They learned his name, his unit, his story, in fragments. They placed flowers. They spoke his name aloud. None of them shared his blood. One caretaker stood by the grave one spring morning, brushing leaves from the stone. "Someone should have been here sooner," she said quietly. That sentence held no accusation, only recognition. I can't pretend that remembrance by strangers replaces family, but I can see how it prevents total erasure. The absence of accountability lingered. No trial named the men who killed Forte. No verdict closed the wound. The crime remained acknowledged but unresolved. Justice, like truth, arrived unevenly. For Forte's family, the lack of narrative shaped memory itself. Without details, imagination filled gaps cautiously. Perhaps they assumed he died quickly. Perhaps they chose not to imagine more. Either way, the truth remained withheld long enough to alter how he was remembered. Grief without story does not settle. It drifts. When congressional recognition finally came decades later, it corrected the historical record, not the human one. It affirmed what had already happened. But it could not restore the years when knowledge might have mattered most. Thomas J. Forte became honored after those who loved him most were no longer waiting. His name was spoken in ceremonies attended by officials and volunteers, not by the people who had known his voice. The human truth of Wereth is not only in the brutality of death, but in the delayed arrival of meaning. Forte's life intersected with history at a point where recognition was postponed until memory itself had thinned. His wife did not stand at Henri Chapelle to hear his story told fully. His parents did not receive the explanation that might have reshaped their mourning. His sister did not hear an officer say, "He protected civilians." That sentence mattered. It arrived too late. I can't pretend that knowing everything heals grief, but I can see how being denied knowledge prolongs it. Thomas J. Forte's absence did not echo loudly in official histories. It echoed quietly in the lives that adjusted around it through remarriage or solitude, through silence or repetition, through objects kept and objects discarded. By the time his story resurfaced, memory had shifted from private to public, from family to institution. The cost of that shift was borne by those who waited without answers. In the end, Forte's humanity endured not because the system preserved it, but because individuals. First, a family in Wereth. Later, volunteers refused to let his name remain only a line in a ledger. The war took his life. Time took his witnesses. What remained was the obligation to remember him correctly, even if remembrance arrived without those who needed it most. That is the human truth at the center of Wereth. Not just how Thomas J. Forte died, but how long the world allowed his story to go unheard. Herman Langer did not think of himself as a caretaker of history. He was a farmer, like his father had been, like the land around Wereth had always required. Memory, to him, was not abstract. It was physical. It lived in fields, in paths walked again and again, in places where something had happened and could not be undone. In 1994, nearly 50 years after the war moved past the Ardennes, Herman walked to the edge of the pasture, where cattle grazed in summer. The grass there grew unevenly. He knew why. He had known since childhood. He carried a simple wooden cross with him, rough cut, unvarnished. On it, he carved names, 11 of them, carefully, deliberately. Thomas J. Forte. He pressed the cross into the ground himself. No officials. No speeches. Just the sound of wood meeting frozen earth. They shouldn't be forgotten, Herman said later, explaining the gesture with the same practicality he brought to everything else. That cross did not change official records. It did not reopen investigations or summon families across the ocean, but it altered the shape of remembrance. For the first time, the men killed outside Wereth were marked not as a footnote, but as individuals tied to a specific place. Visitors began to arrive slowly, veterans first, then historians, then people who had no direct connection at all, only curiosity and a sense that something had been overlooked. They stood by the cross, read the names aloud, and asked questions that had waited decades. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to hold memory on behalf of people you never met, but I can see the responsibility settle into routine, the way it did for Herman quietly, permanently. In 2004, that private act grew into something larger, the U.S. Memorial Wereth was formally established, a stone monument set near the site of the killings. Flags were raised, wreaths laid. The names of the 11 men were carved with care. It became the only memorial in Europe dedicated specifically to African-American soldiers of the Second World War. Thomas J. Forte's name finally stood where it could be seen. Yet even then, something was missing. A photograph, a face to match the name. The Memorial Committee searched archives, contacted agencies, traced records back to Mississippi and Louisiana. They found service numbers, unit assignments, burial plots. They did not find a portrait. "We're still looking," a volunteer would say, years later, holding a folder worn from handling. Someone has to have his picture. That search mattered. It acknowledged that remembrance without likeness is incomplete. A name anchors history. A face restores humanity. In Belgium, another form of care took shape. The Sentinels of Memory program paired local citizens with American graves at Henri Chapelle. Volunteers chose names, learned stories, and assumed responsibility for tending graves as if they belonged to family. Thomas Forte's grave was adopted. Flowers appeared on anniversaries. The stone was cleaned. Leaves brushed away in autumn. On Memorial Day, a small American flag was placed carefully at the base, adjusted so it would not fall. A volunteer stood there one spring, hands cold, reading the inscription again. "Staff Sergeant," she murmured, testing the sound of it. "You were someone's husband." She did not know his wife's name. She did not know if anyone else still spoke it. But she said the sentence anyway, as if naming the relationship might briefly restore it. I can't pretend that tending a grave replaces blood ties, but I can see how it prevents a life from collapsing entirely into abstraction. Recognition continued to arrive in pieces. In 2013, the U.S. Congress formally acknowledged the Wereth massacre, amending wartime records to name it as a crime. The language was careful, legal, overdue. It corrected history, but it did not bring anyone back to receive the correction. No children stood at the ceremony, claiming Forte as father. No niece or nephew spoke on behalf of the family. The acknowledgement landed in a space already shaped by decades of delay. Justice, in this case, did not look like trials or sentences. It looked like inscription, like ceremony, like strangers learning how to pronounce names that had been ignored. The search for Forte's descendants continued. Notices were circulated. Appeals posted online. Researchers traced census records, marriage licenses, migration patterns. Each lead ended quietly. The data thinned. Was his wife's ring kept? Was it passed down? Lost? Discarded when memory became too heavy? No record answers that. The object survived the war, but not documentation. One new detail emerged during archival work, a small one, easily missed. In a supply log from 1944, Forte's handwriting appeared beside a requisition note, precise and tidy. It was not dramatic, just proof that his hand had been there, that he had organized something ordinary in the midst of chaos. That detail mattered. It placed him back in motion, doing what he always did, keeping order, making things work. The memorial at Wereth now receives visitors every year. Some come knowing the story. Others arrive by accident, surprised to find it. They read the names, stand quietly, and leave changed in small ways. Thomas Forte's name is spoken aloud there. It is spoken correctly. It is spoken with care. In Mississippi, where he was born, there is no marker bearing his name. No annual ceremony. No physical place where memory gathers. His connection to that land exists only through records and the quiet persistence of researchers. Across an ocean, his grave is tended by people who did not know him, who learned to care because someone had to. I can't pretend that public memory outweighs personal memory, but I can see how, when personal memory disappears, Public memory becomes the last defense against erasure. What remains of Thomas J. Forte is not a solved case. It is not closure. It is a set of actions repeated by strangers. Brushing leaves, placing flowers, reading a name, asking for a photograph that has not yet surfaced. It is Herman Langer's cross, replaced now by stone, but still rooted in the same ground. It is a grave in Plot C, row 11, grave 55, visited by people who choose to stand there. It is the knowledge that his story survives, not because it was protected, but because people refused to let it end where it was once buried. That is what remains. Every year, in Wereth, Thomas J. Forte's name is spoken out loud. It is read from stone, carried on cold air, repeated by voices that learned it long after his own fell silent. The sound travels across a field where cattle still graze, where snow still settles, where nothing outward marks what once happened except memory, deliberately kept alive. In Mississippi, his birthplace, there is no similar ritual, no marker where neighbors pause, no photograph passed hand to hand. His life ended overseas, and his remembrance stayed there too, shaped by strangers who refused to let his name remain only ink. At Henri Chapelle, volunteers continue their routines. Flowers placed, leaves cleared, a flag straightened after the wind shifts. Someone always checks the inscription, as if expecting it to change. Plot C, row 11, grave 55. I'll come back next year, one caretaker says quietly before leaving. I can't pretend to know whether Thomas Forte would have wanted this kind of remembrance, public, careful, carried by people he never met. But I can see what it prevents. It keeps his life from collapsing into numbers alone. It keeps his death from being the only thing remembered. Across an ocean, his name has found a voice. At home, it remains faint. The echo lingers in that imbalance, in the space between where he is remembered and where he is missing. And in that space, a final question waits, unresolved but necessary. If no one left remembers him personally, does remembering him publicly matter more or less?